Welcome to the Lauder Institute at the University of Pennsylvania. I'm Jules van Binsbergen, Director of the Institute and a finance professor at the Wharton School.
And I'm Jonathan Berk, a finance professor at the Graduate School of Business at Stanford University. This is the All Else Equal podcast.
Welcome back, everybody. Today's episode, I think, is a great episode on a topic that has been on a lot of people's minds, which is the topic of working from home. And I think, Jonathan, that COVID really seems to have put this topic on the map. I think during COVID, a lot of people started working from home. And I think that the big question that is on everybody's mind is working from home a phenomenon that's here to stay? Is this something that has permanently changed the workplace dynamic? Or is working from home something that gradually is going to go away again?
So, Jules, when COVID hit, there were many people who said that the world has now changed and that from now on, we were going to get huge fractions of people working from home. I've never felt that way, basically because I believe that work is daycare for adults. The adults really need structure in their lives, and that's what the jobs provide. The counter argument, though, was, look, there was another equilibrium out there, and COVID was the spark to move from one equilibrium to the other equilibrium. And together with the technological advances, Zoom, that made it very easy to work from home. And it's now 5 years later. I would say my perspective is people seem to be going back to work, not the other way around. And certainly if you look at the traffic between Palo Alto and San Francisco, we're back to the same level of traffic and unpleasantness there was pre-COVID. So what's interesting is in that anecdotal evidence seems to suggest we're going back to the old equilibrium, but I mean, that's anecdotal. And so I think what we wanted to do is get the world expert in this area, somebody who's done a tremendous amount of real research, and just find out what is happening today with work from home.
And Jonathan, just to nuance it a little bit, right? It is definitely possible that the traffic you're experiencing happens on certain days of the week and not others. It is possible that we go to a mixed sort of thing, right? I mean, one thing that I thought was interesting, what you just said, was that when we had Stephen Pinker on in the last two episodes, right, when there are multiple equilibria, it doesn't require much of a focal point and much of a coordination mechanism to suddenly switch from one equilibrium to the other, as you said. And COVID definitely was a very big focal point. Can we agree on that?
No question. So, okay, let's introduce our guest. Our guest is Nick Bloom. He's the William Eberly Professor of Economics at Stanford University. Nick is one of the superstars at Stanford. In his short career, he's managed to be a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, a recipient of the Guggenheim and Sloan Fellowship, a Fritz Medal winner, and a National Science Foundation Career Award. With all that said, I have immense respect for him. His insights into how the economic view of how the internal workings of the firm work, I really think he's probably nobody in the world who better understands that than Nick. And of course, one of his areas of interest is work from home. So Nick, welcome to the show.
Nick, it's great to have you.
Thanks for having me on after having listened to so many shows.
It's really great to have you.
So Nick, you were one of the early researchers who picked up that working from home was going to be a phenomenon that we should think about more deeply, and to also ask the question, which parts of working from home are sort of temporary effects that related to COVID and which parts might be here to stay. So if you had to make a guess, what fraction of the workforce do you think will permanently work from home, and what evidence do you base this on?
So great question. I'll tell you where we are now. Work from home exploded obviously in 2020. It didn't last at that level for long. It dropped pretty rapidly. It dropped through 22, 23. It seems to have stabilized. We're now 26. So what does it look like now? Roughly for Americans, and same is kind of true for Europeans, about a third of people are hybrid, which means they work from home, 2-3 days a week. There's about another 10% just under that are fully remote. And then the remaining group, which is about 60%, is fully in person. So work from home's here to stay, but actually just under half of people now are working from home regularly.
Now, Nick, I remember you and I had a somewhat heated discussion at the beginning of COVID when I said that I didn't think it was going to last. And you said, no, this is going to last. So how would you characterize what has happened in the context of what it was like pre-COVID versus what it is now?
So I'll tell you where we are now. We are basically in a situation where what I think firms are doing is just profitable. So typical large firm, take my employer or Jules's employer, like, including Stanford, University of Pennsylvania, etc., has three groups of people. So it has the majority have to go in every day. So take Stanford, cleaners, food service, janitorial, transport, security, they're going to go in every day. There's the second group, which are professionals, faculty, admin. They are like middle managers, professionals, grads in firms. They're typically hybrid. So normally you're going in Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. You're at home Monday, Friday. And then there's a few folks, like for Stanford, it's, about 1,000 people. They're fully remote. And they tend not to live anywhere nearby. And, why are they fully remote? It's because they're cheaper. So for the university, this is the most cost-effective way of doing it. And for companies, it's typically profit maximizing. So I think it will stay, because anything that makes companies money tends to stick around.
What was it about COVID that made this change? Because before COVID, what fraction of people were fully remote or hybrid?
Just to give you a sense, COVID has increased the number of days that we've worked from home permanently by about fourfold. So it's around 7% of days were fully worked from home in 2019. In 2026, it's about 25%. That's why the office market is struggling, because a lot of people aren't going to offices. Now, why is that? I think pre-COVID, as in 2019, we were working from home too few days. And I mean too few days in terms of what is maximizing for firm profits. Why is it profitable? I have a study in Nature. We did a big randomized control trial. Trip.com, a $50 billion travel agent. And we randomized whether folks came into the office 5 days or 3 days each week and worked from home too. What do you find? We had 1,500 professionals. These are all graduate employees. You found that, firstly, there's no effect on performance. They're not worse, but they're not better when they work from home 2 days a week. When you interview them, they say, well, look, I need to come in. I clearly need to come in, 2-3 days a week for mentoring and connecting up and building culture. But those fourth and fifth days, it's not obvious that they are net helpful, because when I'm at home, it's quiet, so I can study more and I avoid on commute. So the evidence was, and there's a lot of evidence from 6, 12, 18, 24-month reviews, performance reviews, innovation scores, etc., that performance was about flat. The other big finding was quit rates went down by a third. And for Trip.com, they said every person that quits costs us about $50,000. Why is that? Because if they quit, we've got to go out, re-interview, re-recruit, re-onboard, re-get up to speed. There's a clear performance tenure curve. And they estimated the hybrid had boosted profits by something like $20 million a year. So that's why it's here now to stay. And honestly, we should have done it in 2019. Fully remote, the kind of thing we're forced to in the lockdown, is not ideal. But zero remote is also not ideal. Basically, you want some kind of balance.
So you're saying the mentoring that people need can just be done in the few days that they are there. And it practically, there's not mentoring going on every day anyway. So as long as you coordinate that a bit, you should be fine.
Yeah, it's a bit of both. So what you see is in companies that come in 3 days a week, two things happen. A is you tend to compress in-face activities more into those 3 days. So you don't get quite as much as before, but you're not going to spend hours in your office on email and reading stuff in your day. And secondly, there is probably a little bit less face-to-face mentoring, but there are some benefits of working from home. In fact, just to explain, there's a Proceeding of the National Academy of Sciences paper. It's a great paper looking at groups that are randomized into solving the traveling salesman problem and seeing the best way to do it. And they have 3 treatment groups. One group where they're all in a room together for 6 hours. The second group where they're all separate for 6 hours and at the last minute meet up. And then the third group, they're together for an hour, separate for an hour, together for an hour. And the third group ends up performing best. Why? Because it looks like for problem solving, some combination of kind of together energizing and quiet, deep work thinking is best. And that's kind of what you get with hybrid. So I think it's more that hybrid in 3 at home 2, say, which is the most common, with the 3 being Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, gets you almost enough mentoring, almost enough building culture, and has this upside of quiet time. And then in addition, this second upside that it reduces turnover.
Nick, let me play devil's advocate and tell me how we solve the problem. So I would say work is daycare for adults. In other words, there's a limit to how much you can achieve through incentives and contracting. And at some point, you need somebody who's observing and looking at what you're doing in terms of motivation and mentoring and that kind of thing. So where's the cost of working from home in terms of mentoring and that kind of thing?
You're exactly right. The two key points I say is one is if you have people work from home, you have to have performance reviews. You're exactly right. In the office, you can see what you're doing. Jonathan, if you're my boss and we're in the office together, you can see, am I sitting at my desk typing away, or am I kind of asleep, goofing off, chatting all the time, watching Champions League, whatever. Now, if I'm at home, you have no idea of what I'm up to. So you have to, rather than evaluate inputs, evaluate outputs, so performance review. And I will tell companies, if you do not have good performance review systems, you should not let people work from home. It turns out that pretty much all jobs can have moderate to reasonably good performance reviews. So typically in many careers, you're not really evaluating people by watching them, you're evaluating people by what they're doing. So on the first basis, the first thing is performance reviews go critically with working from home. The other one, just to be clear, is coordination. So come back to Jules's question earlier. I tell companies, second, you should coordinate the days that folks come in. It seems kind of obvious, but what you don't want is a system where I tell you, you can come in 3 days and you pick it. Because what you'll find is some people come in on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, others Tuesday, it's a mess. I actually had a friend and she said she came in Monday, Friday in a 2-day system. And I was like, why is that? That seems a bit unusual. And she said, well, I don't like my colleagues. That was just a horribly badly designed system. But so coming back, I have another actually randomized control trial I'll tell you about right now, to highlight, I'm not pushing for fully remote. We take a company that has fully remote employees and we randomize between the remaining fully remote and coming in 1 day a month as a team. And on that 1 day they come in, it's more social events, lunches, training, etc. What we found, and this is for 600 employees, is a year later, the 1 day a month group, their quit rate's halved and their performance is up about 10%. And why is that? Because coming in at least 1 day a month energizes people, makes them connected up. You see on the Slack messages that they ask for help more. So, I see Jules 1 day a month, I'm more likely to reach out for him and ask for help. So generally, my advice to companies is probably something like 3 days in, 2 at home is about right. Conditional on, coming back to Jonathan's point, you have good performance reviews and your days in are enforced and they're coordinated. So, the problem cases are when either people choose their days and they include Saturday and Sunday because they don't like seeing their colleagues, or they're supposed to be in 3. I talked to a Fortune 50 company. I talked to the head of HR and, they're one of these extremely probably multi-million-dollar paid people. And he said, what, we're supposed to be in 3 days a week. We evaluate it based on an 8-week looking back rolling average using swipes into the office. We enforce if somebody goes below 1.5 days a week. And I was like, 1.5, but the policy's 3. He said, yeah, well, we can't really measure it very well because people may not be coming in because of travel or because of sick leave or because of holidays or they're visiting another office, etc. And so in that case, you have a policy that's kind of badly enforced and so it doesn't really work very well. It's kind of like saying, look, we'd like you to drive on the right side of the road, but you're occasionally okay to drive on the left. I mean, enforcement of policy is about as important as the actual policy itself. So I think 3 in, 2 at home is the norm, and probably as a first guess is maybe not a bad policy, but you do need to coordinate and you do need good performance review systems.
The natural experiments that you set up, which I think are amazing, but they do focus on sort of the short-term measurement of the performance and whether there's a change there, right? And so if we do a medical experiment and we apply the medicine, we get it FDA approved if in the short term there aren't any side effects that we do not understand. But the long-term 10, 20, 30-year effects of a lot of these things might actually be quite large and hard to measure because so many other things happen. If you had to speculate, given the conclusions that you drew about the short-term effects, do you think that the long-term effects also on society as a whole might actually be quite a bit bigger? You essentially argued that the performance didn't really go down. It was pretty much the same. Do you think that the long-term effects might be different?
My suspicion is, this is more anecdotal, that maybe if you're in 2 days a week, certainly if you're in 1, you're probably losing stuff. It's not clear that's optimal. Coming back to the mentoring, building culture, innovating, in this company, trip.com, we did look at data up to 24 months and we didn't see any negative effects. I have another earlier study, actually pre-pandemic, where we looked at people coming in just 1 day a week. So that's a more extreme version of work from home. And in that, we found promotion rates halved. One big impact is what was called the donut effect, which is if people are coming in less days and working from home more. I mean, even if you're still coming in 3 days a week, you don't need to live as far into the city center. And we've seen a massive movement of individuals from the city center out to the suburbs. And Jonathan, I remember you mentioned, I thought you owned an apartment in central San Francisco. So that kind of property market has not done well since 2019, whereas the suburb has done really well because people don't feel like they need to live in city centers as much. And you see it very clearly in the Zillow data. The suburbs of big cities have done the best. So it's not, Hawaii has actually done the best. It's Tahoe, or kind of closer Tahoe and suburban New York, because that's where professionals have moved to. The other asset market that's obviously affected is office property. And that is probably more permanent. It's not as devastating as you'd think because most companies are in hybrid. Most companies view as, look, if we're going to come in 3 days a week, we still need an office because it's not very easy. One way to do it is that we do a teaching rooms. Like, Nick, you come in Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. Jules, your team is Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. Jonathan, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. But the problem with that is it's complicated. Teams don't overlap. People complain that they've got the Friday or the Monday. So most firms have moved away from that. There are some, like Zoom, actually. I spoke to Eric Yuan. He said sales is in Monday, Wednesday, engineering Tuesday, Thursday. But you notice that's a 2-day-a-week schedule. And as soon as you go to 3, it doesn't really work. So typically companies are saying, well, we need the office and it's just emptier. But not all of them. And some activities like HR, payroll, call centers have moved totally remote. So the office market is kind of down. I would say it's out. I mean, it's taken a blow. The final angle, I say that's pretty fascinating. You have some work on is fertility. So it looks like work from home, particularly hybrid, is a big booster to fertility. People kind of jump to the immediate, you're at home, what are you getting up to? I don't think that's the main driver because if you look at where it's coming from, it's kind of graduates in their 30s. I think it's much more folks that have, say, one kid and are thinking, this is really hard work. And suddenly them and their spouse are allowed to work from home 2 days a week. And they're like, okay, this is more manageable. We'll have a second kid.
So where's that fertility? Is that a result? Is that something you guys have found?
We are working on it right now. We're just getting, to give rough ballpark numbers, we estimate the pandemic in the US probably caused potentially 300,000 more births a year. If you take a couple where previously they both went in 5 days a week and now they are both hybrid, on average, they're having about half a child more.
Wow.
Which is an enormous number.
It's a huge number. Yeah.
But, that's a big change. If you're both able to work from home 2 days a week, it's a lot easier to look after kids. And so people are rationally saying, on average, every other couple is going to have one more kid.
So with plummeting birth rates, that seems a relevant thing to study.
Massively. The area where it's most obviously relevant to is Asia. I mean, it's an issue in Europe and the US, but in Asia, the fertility rates are incredibly low and actually work from home levels are very low. So if I was to have another long run prediction, in Asia, they will move towards, governments. Actually, I've spoken to some of the governments out there supporting this because the fertility issue is such a big issue for long run growth.
Now, Nick, what about the differences across jobs? So blue-collar jobs tend to be jobs where there's no flexibility whatsoever, and white-collar jobs have more flexibility. How does that affect the workforce and the perception of how people are treated, shall we say? I mean, most people perceive working from home as a perk. And so how does that play out for different jobs in the economy?
Exactly. So on average, we have surveyed, I'm trying to think of this before, 200,000 people across the US and globally, a bunch of papers. But one of the questions we've asked a lot, and there's also kind of other evidence on it, is how much people value working from home 2-3 days a week. And the answer is about the same as 6 to 8% more pay. So you're right, it is deemed as a perk. There's a spread, but for the average person, hybrid is about as much as a kind of mean healthcare plan. So A, it's definitely is a perk. Then B, if you look, higher earning, higher educated people are more likely to get it. So it has absolutely, in the first instance, increased inequality in a sense of kind of utility, money plus perks. The third point is, it goes to the title of the podcast, all else equal. Issue is all else is not equal because what happened from 2020 to 2023 was in-person jobs saw faster pay increases than hybrid and remote jobs. Why? Because no one really wants to come in every day, 5 days a week. And so effectively labor supply shrinks and people require more wages. You show in-person jobs, their pay went up relatively by about 8%. So what's happened is, yes, it is a perk, but the labor markets kind of offset it by effectively paying people more to come in. So Coming back to why are firms allowing hybrid, the simple answer of hybrid doesn't particularly increase productivity, but it generates a perk people value at 6-7%. It's profitable. There's money on the table. Effectively, you pay people 4% less. The company's up and the individual up because they got a perk that's worth 6 or 7%. And that's kind of where things have settled down. You do now see companies that require folks in 5 days a week, JP Morgan or Goldman, are going to effectively have to pay them a little bit more. And if they think it's worth it, that's fine. But that's kind of where it's settled down.
So now, Nick, the last couple decades, there have been a lot of secular trends, right? We had a lot of people study the skill premium and other things. And of course, we just had a major technological innovation that's really starting to affect things quite a bit, which is the arrival of AI. If you had to make predictions about how that's going to change this equation, what would your predictions be? For example, next week I'm about to fly to San Francisco to teach in a classroom with students there. Do you think we will ever reach a moment where a hologram of me will be in the classroom together with the student and it will feel as if I'm in the room? Or do you think we're never going to reach that stage?
I think we're a long way from that. So I kind of feel, look, a lot of times for faculty, this is particularly to our job, but it's a personal trainer effect.
Yes.
So we could deliver those lectures over Zoom, but we know the students aren't paying attention. They're watching Netflix if they're there at all, or, they have their screens turned off. It's a bit like, you have this personal trainer turns up to tell you to do stuff you would have done anyway. But the benefit is they make you do it. They provide you incentive. And it seems irrational, but it is what it is, and I have the same thing. So it's one of the reasons, like you guys, I'm sure you cold call in class because you make sure that people are paying attention. So in the immediate term, I don't see that. Just, so folks know, it's kind of interesting. Inequality in the US and Europe in general rose a lot from 1980 to 2010. So there's 40 years of very rapidly rising inequality. It seemed to kind of peak at about 2010 and move sideways until 2019. So it didn't go up anymore, but it was very high. And then it fell during the pandemic, in part because of probably work from home. It's one story. It was unpleasant to have to come in, so you had to pay people more. And those are low-paid jobs. And now in 26, AI is the big question. That most of the evidence suggests it will probably reduce inequality. Why? Because it tends to be more likely to replace jobs like ours, kind of professional, analytical jobs, and less likely to replace in-person jobs. But nobody knows. That's the big question. Work from home has probably reduced it a bit, but it's not had a major effect.
But the teaching example brings up an issue which I wonder about, which is the non-measured effects of socialization. Because I've gotten quite despondent over the years about my effectiveness as an instructor. I don't think it's personal to me. And I think basically, I don't think we do a very good job communicating knowledge as a profession. I think most of the stuff we communicate is lost immediately. But what I would say is the discussion that occurs in the classroom is a crucially important part of learning, right? It's not just facts or anything. It's the fact that you're able to respond in an intelligent way to some new concept you hadn't thought of. And that teaches you these skills of thinking critically and analytically. And the extent to which that, and you certainly, my experience was impossible to do on Zoom. When we were teaching remotely, that was very, very difficult. The question is that's endemic in society, and it's very difficult to measure something like that. Or is it?
I had the same experience. Zoom teaching was horrible. I would say the amount of content, I reduced the amount of content I delivered to roughly 50%.
Yeah, same.
So I would say it's half the efficiency of Zoom teaching. And the other thing, my other rough rule of thumb is when I teach in person, ideally I only talk half the class. So, the students are roughly speaking the other half. And why? Because you want them to engage and learn. And, if I'm speaking, they've turned off. So I'm kind of like speaking and then have a class discussion. So yeah, right now there is not the technology to replace it. I mean, the best thing I've seen, there's a company called Noro up in San Francisco. It's these 12-foot by 12-foot screens with cameras throughout them. They work well. Why do they work well? The main thing that they do, I've tested out a few times. Well, one is you can see people's height and their trousers and their shoes, and it feels a bit more connected. But I think more importantly is you can see their hands. So why does that matter? It matters a lot because they're not playing on their phone or doing email on their laptop. So if the three of us had full body things, and imagine Jules was on his phone all the time texting, it would suddenly become obvious if I could see his whole body. But, with his head, he can do whatever he likes. And there's evidence from Microsoft that on a typical Teams meeting, people are multitasking 50% of the time, which is an enormous amount of time. Probably for in-person meetings, it's about 5%. So that's a huge issue. with communications. And I don't, know at what point. It's really the personal trainer effect. If the three of us are in a physical meeting room, Jonathan, Jules, me, none of us can easily be, texting. It's very obvious. Whereas on Zoom, we're probably, I don't know how many emails you guys have sent during this call. Hopefully none, but
Well, I mean, yeah, I agree completely. But there's also this other aspect, which for reasons I don't fully understand, we don't emphasize, which is when you learn from other people, you learn by just interacting with them without explicitly understanding that there's learning going on, right? So you're in the office, you're talking to somebody about something. It's not obvious to you that you've learned anything, but in fact, it's pretty critical to the learning process. Certainly in the classroom, that is essential. As you say, Nick, unless you've got an interaction going amongst the students, you're missing a huge amount of learning. And the extent to which that is not occurring, I don't know how you measure that, but it seems to me there's something there and there's something important there.
Classroom teaching is an activity that is best done in person. So there are activities like being a nurse, caring for somebody, cleaning stuff, serving hamburgers at best in person. I think classroom teaching goes into that. There are other activities as part of education, maybe one-on-one supervising that can be done on Zoom 2/3 of the time. In fact, the three of us are on Zoom and, oddly enough, Jonathan and I are literally 100 meters apart, less 50 meters because we're neighbors, but we agreed to do this on Zoom because it's easier. So there are some things where you have three people that are clearly paying attention, know each other, meet all the time. But if there is 50 of us in a meeting, you can guess that there'd be, 8 paying attention and 42 would be doing email.
And the other thing I think also, particularly with MBA teaching, I don't know how it is for other classes, is that the students are very aware of how the other students in the class are value judging what is being discussed and whether or not it's perceived as true, whether it's perceived as relevant. And those social cues and that body language, you can only really read when you're in the room with them. And over Zoom with the 40 little screens, it's just, and most people have it off anyway. So all of that is not happening. And I do think that with learning, judging the values and whether or not people generally perceive it to be true or question it, I think is part of the learning process very much.
Nick, thank you so much for being on the show. It's been fascinating.
It's been wonderful. Thank you.
Thanks again, guys. It was lovely to talk.
Thanks for listening to All Else Equal podcast. Please leave us a review at Apple Podcasts. We love to hear from our listeners. And be sure to catch our next episode by subscribing or following the show wherever you listen to your podcasts. For more information and episodes, visit alelseequalpodcast.com or follow us on LinkedIn. The All Else Equal podcast is a joint production of the Lauder Institute at the University of Pennsylvania and the Graduate School of Business at Stanford University, and is produced by University FM.